Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling a profoundly difficult subject.
Yeah.
The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
It's heavy, yes. But understanding the human impact, both immediate and long-term, is just so crucial.
Absolutely. This isn't just history, it's a story about immense human suffering, with lessons that, frankly, echo right through to today. Our goal here is to really unpack that human cost, drawing on the extensive research.
That's right. We're talking August 6th and 9th, 1945. Instantly, or very nearly instantly, something like 210,000 people lost their lives.
Just staggering numbers.
And beyond that, you have the survivors, the Hibakusha. Their experience is unique in all of human history. They're the only people who have lived through a nuclear attack.
And their perspective, their ongoing struggles, it's unparalleled, isn't it?
Completely. It gives us insight we can't get anywhere else.
Now, just briefly, the context. World War II, the push for Japan's surrender. You have the Manhattan Project developing these weapons, and President Truman makes the call to use them. The initial reasoning given was, to speed up the war's end, potentially save lives that would be lost in an invasion.
Though that justification, it's been analyzed and debated quite a bit since, especially considering the Soviet Union's involvement coming into play.
Right. And it's interesting, even back then, there were doubts. Some pretty senior figures, military leaders like Eisenhower, scientists on the project itself, they had serious ethical concerns.
They did. There was unease about unleashing something like this. It highlights that tension, right? The sheer power versus the morality of using it. A tension we still live with, frankly.
So that's what we'll trace today, the human story. Starting with that immediate, almost unthinkable devastation.
Okay.
Then moving into the onset of radiation sickness, that terrifying unknown. And finally, the long haul, the health effects, the psychological scars stretching out over decades.
It's a grim timeline, but necessary to understand.
Let's start with the moment of detonation, the raw physics.
Right. You've got three main immediate forces hitting people on the ground. The blast wave, immense air pressure, radiant heat, incredibly intense, and then the ionizing radiation.
Lethal.
Absolutely lethal. In Nagasaki, if you were within, say, 500 meters of ground zero, almost 100% death rate instantly.
Unbelievable.
Even out to a kilometer, maybe 90%. It's just total destruction of life in that zone.
And the descriptions from the research, the eyewitness accounts, they're horrific. Carbonized bodies, people burned literally down to white bone, flash burns, peeling skin away.
Yeah, and buildings just collapsing, turning into fuel for these massive firestorms that swept through.
There's that detail about babies being carried on their mothers' backs.
It's incredibly disturbing. The force of the blast, it's reported, could decapitate infants carried like that. It just shows the utter indiscriminate violence of the weapon.
It's almost impossible to picture. But some people, even close in, did survive initially.
A few. Mostly those shielded by something substantial. Thick concrete, maybe deep in a basement, an air raid shelter.
But survival didn't mean they were okay.
Not at all. Many who survived the initial blast and heat were terribly injured by flying debris, glass, metal, wood, all superheated, maybe irradiated, moving at high speed.
And a lot of those initial survivors, they didn't make it long.
No. Severe injuries, terrible burns, often compounded. Many died within the first 3 months. The numbers, just to reiterate, Hiroshima, around 140,000 dead initially, maybe 78,000 injured. Population was about 350,000. Nagasaki, roughly 73,000 dead, 75,000 injured out of maybe 270,000 people.
And we have to stress, these weren't primarily soldiers.
Overwhelmingly civilians, women, children, older people. Many younger men were away fighting, yes, but tragically, a lot of students had been mobilized to work in factories, some military-related, right in the city.
So they were caught in it too. Whole communities just
right.
Gone. Okay, let's shift to the aftermath. The struggle for those who are still alive.
It was chaos. The medical system just ceased to exist, basically. Hospitals destroyed, doctors, nurses, rescue teams killed or injured themselves.
Especially bad in Hiroshima, the research says.
Extremely bad. Over 90% of medical personnel there were casualties themselves. Nagasaki had a slightly different situation with the medical college hospital.
Ah, yes, the concrete building.
Exactly. It offered some protection. They still lost about half their staff and students, a terrible blow. But more survived inside compared to elsewhere nearby, though the hospital itself wasn't functional right away.
Just unimaginable, trying to provide care in that situation.
But they tried. Surviving staff, students, even injured ones set up makeshift first aid posts on the outskirts within days.
And then some outside help started trickling in.
A little. Teams from the Omura Navy Hospital, about 45 kilometers away, managed to get there. They were crucial.
How many could they help?
They transported about 700 severely injured people back to their hospital, mostly burn victims. Maybe a few hundred of those ultimately survived with intensive care.
But that's out of how many injured?
Tens of thousands. In Nagasaki alone, estimates are around 30,000 severely injured. The help, while heroic, was just a drop in the ocean.
And they had nothing to work with, did they?
Practically nothing. No antibiotics, no plasma, not even enough basic IV fluids. Treatment was incredibly primitive oil, ointments for these horrific burns. That was often all they could do.
So many people who might have survived their initial injuries just couldn't make it.
Exactly. They succumbed to infection, dehydration, lack of food. The conditions for survival, even if you weren't fatally wounded by the blast itself, were just brutal.
Which brings us to this other layer of horror, the radiation sickness. Acute radiation syndrome, ARS. This is something new, wasn't it? Doctors didn't understand it at first.
Not at all. They had no experience with this. They didn't even realize initially these were atomic bombs or grasp the danger of the invisible radiation.
How did they figure it out?
It took weeks. Painstaking work, autopsies by Japanese and U.S. pathologists trying to understand what was happening at a cellular level. By then, of course, it was far too late for many.
And the symptoms. Just terrifying. The research mentions hair loss being a really visible, frightening sign.
Yes. That became this dreaded indicator. Survivors reportedly checked their pillows every morning, terrified of seeing hair fall out. It often signaled a fatal outcome.
And other things.
Purpura, those purple spots under the skin from internal bleeding. Bleeding from the gums, nosebleeds, bloody diarrhea, and high fevers.
Which they first thought was just infection.
Initially, yes, and an infection was rampant, obviously, but they slowly realized the fever was also a direct result of the bone marrow being destroyed by radiation, wiping out white blood cells. The body's defenses were collapsing.
So it was a multi-pronged attack on the body. Trauma, burns, radiation damage, infection.
Precisely. And that bloody diarrhea wasn't just a symptom, it meant the intestinal lining was damaged, so people couldn't absorb water, leading to severe dehydration. ARS was this whole constellation of failures.
Did things improve slightly later on, medically?
Gradually, yes. A few weeks later, more supplies and personnel started arriving, so some who'd survived until early September had a slightly better chance. But the severely injured, the elderly, those with high doses, they kept dying.
Leading to those final death tolls for 1945. About 140,000 in Hiroshima, 73,000 in Nagasaki. Just devastating.
An almost incomprehensible loss of life.
But the story doesn't end there, tragically. Let's talk about the long-term health consequences, the late effects.
Right. These started showing up years later. The first big one was leukemia.
When did that start to emerge?
Around 1949, so 4 years after the bombings, doctors started noticing this clear rise in leukemia cases among survivors, even in children who'd been exposed.
And it got worse.
The rates peaked around 1955, 10 years out, and stayed significantly high for over a decade after that. Both acute and chronic forms were seen.
And later studies confirmed the link to radiation dose.
Absolutely. As dosimetry improved the methods for estimating individual radiation doses, the link became undeniable. Higher dose meant exponentially higher risk of leukemia.
How much higher was the risk overall?
For exposed individuals, the total incidence was something like 4 to 5 times higher compared to people in Nagasaki who weren't exposed.
And it didn't stop leukemia, did it? There's something called MDS.
Myelodysplastic syndromes, yes. This is a more recent concern, appearing in elderly survivors who were children during the bombing. It shows long-term damage to the blood-forming stem cells in the bone marrow.
And MDS can lead to leukemia.
It often does, particularly acute leukemia. So even now, decades later, the bombs are still claiming lives through these delayed effects.
It's truly chilling. And leukemia wasn't the only cancer, right? Solid tumors started increasing later, too.
That's right. Around 1960, 15 years post-bombing, they saw increases in cancers like lung, breast, thyroid, stomach, colon, liver, skin, bladder.
Was that also dose-dependent?
Yes, very clearly. The risk went up significantly for those exposed to over 100 milligray. And incredibly, even by 2018, when the average survivor age was 82, that elevated risk for solid cancers hadn't gone down. It seemed to plateau, just persisting.
And some survivors developed multiple separate cancers.
Yes, particularly those with higher radiation exposure. It makes sense, sadly. The radiation exposure was whole body, so damage occurred everywhere, potentially triggering independent cancers in different organs over time.
Is there a theory for why these cancers appear so late?
One prominent idea is the stem cell target hypothesis. Basically, the radiation damaged critical stem cells throughout the body.
the ones that repair tissues.
Exactly. They survived the initial hit but carried DNA damage. Over decades of dividing and doing their job, they accumulated more errors, eventually leading to cancer much later in life, like a slow-burning fuse.
What about those exposed in utero? The effects must have been particularly harsh.
Devastating. Higher rates of miscarriage, congenital malformations, but the most striking effect was microcephaly, abnormally small head size, and related intellectual disability.
Linked to dose.
Directly linked to the mother's radiation dose, especially during early critical stages of pregnancy. The developing brain is incredibly vulnerable.
And their long-term cancer risk.
Also increased. Those exposed in utero showed higher cancer rates in their early adulthood compared to unexposed peers.
So cancers were the main long-term issue. Anything else significant?
More recently, yes. There's growing evidence for an increased risk of heart attacks, acute myocardial infarction, particularly in heavily exposed survivors over 70.
Really? Heart attacks, too?
It seems so. Again, it appears dose-dependent. The exact way radiation causes this years later is still being studied, maybe accelerating artery hardening, things like that.
The physical toll just seems endless, affecting so many systems.
Yeah.
What about the children of the survivors, the second generation? Any genetic effects passed down?
That's obviously been a huge area of research and anxiety. So far, the major studies have not found statistically higher rates of birth defects, leukemia, or other cancers in the children of survivors,
Even with modern genetic studies.
even with recent DNA-level studies. However, some animal studies do suggest heritable effects are possible, which understandably keeps the worry alive for the second generation.
So monitoring continues.
Definitely. There's a large ongoing study following the second generation, especially as they reach ages where cancers become more common generally. It's crucial work.
Okay, the physical damage is immense. But the psychological wounds must have been just as deep, right?
Absolutely. Right after the war, they observed something called Igenbaku Burabura Bayo, atomic bomb, aimless disease, or numbness syndrome.
What did that look like?
Emotional numbness, lack of energy, difficulty working or engaging with life. We'd probably recognize it now as a form of severe PTSD. The trauma was just unimaginable.
There's that phrase from Dr. Lifton, death in life.
Yes, Robert J. Lifton's work was seminal. It captures that feeling some survivors had witnessing so much death, making impossible choices for survival, leading to profound guilt, a sense of lost humanity.
Did that guilt and trauma persist?
For many, yes. It could lie dormant and then resurface. Later studies continued to find high rates of depression, PTSD symptoms, and there's that documented spike in anxiety every August around the anniversaries.
And just the ongoing fear of radiation itself.
A constant stressor. Even during routine annual health checks, that fear of what the radiation might still be doing inside them is very real for many Hibakusha.
So physical illness, psychological trauma, and they had to rebuild their lives in cities that were basically gone.
Total devastation. Homes, jobs, communities wiped out. And meaningful government help was slow coming. Japan was shattered economically after the war.
When did things start to change for the Hibakusha in terms of support?
Real recovery for Japan's economy started around 1955, partly due to the Korean War. Dedicated medical and social support programs specifically for Hibakusha really began to take shape starting in 1957.
And that support is comprehensive now.
It's much better, yes. The government provides extensive health care coverage for recognized Hibakusha, covering most conditions, except infectious diseases, plus monthly financial support. It's a huge contrast to the early post-war years. Significant resources are now dedicated to their care and well-being.
That's a long overdue recognition, I suppose. Now let's shift gears slightly. The research also looked at simulations of what if this happened today?
Right. Researchers at Nagasaki and Hiroshima universities did this important simulation study. They modeled what a 16-kiloton bomb, like Hiroshima's, and a much larger 1-megaton hydrogen bomb would do to a modern city of 1 million people.
And the results? Still catastrophic even for the smaller bomb.
Chillingly so. The 16-kiloton simulation projected something like 66,000 immediate deaths, over 200,000 severe injuries, huge numbers affected by radiation. And then over the next 50 years, hundreds of extra leukemia deaths, thousands of extra deaths from other cancers.
And the megaton bomb.
Far, far worse immediate destruction, obviously. Hundreds of thousands killed instantly, even more injured. Interestingly, the area of intense radiation might be slightly smaller because those bigger bombs are usually detonated higher up,
But the scale of destruction.
would make any effective rescue or medical response impossible. Infrastructure gone, communications weapons out, casualties overwhelming everything. It's simply unsurvivable on a societal level.
It really drives home that even one modern nuclear weapon detonation is an unthinkable catastrophe.
Exactly. And these simulations don't even touch on things like nuclear winter or famine from a wider conflict, work pioneered by people like Carl Sagan and groups like IPPNW. The global consequences could be apocalyptic.
Which brings us back, really, to the Hibakusha and their legacy.
Yes. Their fight for a nuclear-free world, the first generation, those who lived it, their time is sadly running short.
But their entire lives have been shaped by this experience, this question.
Why? Why were these made? Why used? And why can't we get rid of them? That's been their driving force.
And they've been incredibly powerful advocates, haven't they?
Immensely powerful. Their testimonies were vital in the push for the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Their moral authority contributed significantly to ICAN winning the Nobel Peace Prize that year.
Yet, the nuclear powers still hold on to deterrence, despite treaty obligations like Article 6 of the NPT.
It's a stark contradiction, isn't it? The Hibakusha see that clearer than anyone. Their mission now, in their later years, is to pass on their ethical wisdom.
To new generations. To leaders.
Especially to those who didn't live through it, and crucially, to leaders in nuclear-armed states. They believe, and it's hard to argue, that our survival as a species might depend on finally moving beyond deterrence.
It requires a different kind of leadership.
Courageous leadership. Innovative thinking. Breaking the old pattern.
Their lives stand as this undeniable testament to why we need that change. Living proof of the consequences.
Absolutely. They fight with such incredible strength, urging us all, leaders, citizens, to learn from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, to dismantle these arsenals for the sake of humanity's future. Their resilience is just remarkable.
This has been, well, a very sobering deep dive, but incredibly important, I think. The sheer scale of the suffering, immediate and ongoing, is hard to comprehend.
It truly is. And the Hibakusha's perspective, their direct experience, it tells us more about the reality of nuclear weapons than any statistic or simulation ever could.
And those simulations are terrifying enough, warning us what even one detonation would mean today.
The Hibakusha's call for abolition isn't just about the past. It's an urgent lesson for our survival now.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? In a world still armed with these weapons, what's our responsibility? How do we make sure that ethical wisdom, born from such terrible suffering, actually guides us towards a safer future?
That's the question they compel us to ask and to act on, with courage, wisdom, and resolve.